Hello, everybody. I'm the Sonoran Desert grower. This is my channel. Today, I am researching what a permaculture food forest is. This is Geoff Lawton. He is a world-renowned permaculture designer. Let's see what he has to say about what a food forest is.
Food forest. Well, we're all quite familiar with forests and forests as an ecosystem with great diversity of plants, animals and fungi all harmonizing together and interreacting in many niches and layers designed by nature, maintained as a system in perfect balance. Well, imagine that as a system that produces food. The majority of the elements in that system being productive. That's a food forest. So by understanding how nature designs forest systems so they're self-maintaining, self-replicating, we can model that system.
Okay, so I want you guys to pay attention to self-replicating, and we're modeling a naturally occurring system. So each ecosystem has a food forest that is unique to that place. So if you're in an area like this, where obviously there's a lot of water, you can grow things that are tropical. Just the fact that there's a citrus here tells me that it doesn't freeze that often here. So it's probably hot and wet. It lends itself to putting a bunch of fruit trees and having them sustain themselves off of the rainwater. But people will see a video like this and they won't actually pick up the information that is being communicated. The imagery becomes what the food forest is, but it's a lot more complex than that.
With productive species, so that we can produce food in the most sustainable way with the minimum amount of input for the maximum amount of output anywhere in the world.
That's a very important point. I agree with him on there. And that's something I'm always talking about, is doing more, is growing more food with less water. And that is that concept of getting the most output for minimal input.
That's a food forest system that we can actually design and work with in long-term and permanent situations.
Again, there's an emphasis on the long game, right? So we're talking about permanent long-term systems, not something that when a mega drought hits, you're gonna have to cut it down. It's gonna be something that's gonna thrive in the mega drought.
All forests have layers. So you start off with a canopy layer, that's the top of the forest. Then you have understory layers, and under those you have bush and shrub layers, going down to herbaceous layers, which are
So this is basic food forest theory, and this exists in the Sonoran Desert. In an urban environment, we're getting at understory plants, right? In the Sonoran Desert, these canopy plants would be like cottonwoods or pine trees. So you're only going to find that in riparian areas, right? But these understory plants would be like the mesquite, the palo verde, ironwood, and then we have bushes and shrubs. So wolfberries, jojobas, there's so many in the herbaceous layer. So let's keep going.
woody plants. And then you have a root yield. You have plants that actually have large starchy roots. And then on the ground you have ground covers, and you also have a vertical layer of climbers. Now all forests have those layers. In the tropics, you can have emergent palms and understory palms, and you can have slight variations in different climates, but you have a basic set of layers that occupy all the space. When we design a food forest, we put that layering system into action to our benefit for production and maintenance through function. Here in the subtropics, you have Tamarillo.
So again, ecosystem is super important. He's in the subtropical area where he can get away with a lot of food-bearing plants. Here in the Sonoran Desert, you're gonna have to go with the native plants that are edible. When we're talking about roots and things like that, there are roots that are medicinal, but not necessarily edible, right? So it kind of depends on if what you're trying to do. And for example, you can make a pit to cook with agave plants, right? And you can eat agave plants. So it's just a matter of what you're trying to do and what you're going to be putting in your landscape to achieve those ends.
As an understory, and you have taro and cocoa yam and cassava as a root yield. That changes from climate to climate. Then you have understory productive trees like feijoa, guava and citrus, and large herbs like bananas. And then you have support species like the ice cream bean and the tipuana tipu and casuarina. They're large trees, but they continue to support the forest by cycling nutrient. You also have understory nitrogen fixers like the acacias and the leucaena and the cassia and albizia species. They're all really good, fast functioning, fast carbon pathways that fix nitrogen and can be chopped to the ground for mulch as the space that they're occupying can be taken up by the productive species. Here we have rose apples, mulberry, we have...
Okay, so again, you have to think about the drylands and the plants we have here. And this is where the disconnect happens, because you're listening to people like Geoff for a totally different ecosystem. And it's a lot harder to visualize what this is going to look like here. You're not going to have a lot of plants that you can use as filler that are not native plants, because then you're going to have to use a lot of water, and that kind of defeats the purpose because it doesn't become a regenerative system, a self-sustaining system. So I just kind of want to, I'm going to pause the video a lot and just kind of remind you guys, we're in the desert here, right? So our chop and drop is going to look very different. For example, if you're growing the big three edibles, like trees, the big three edible trees would be mesquite, ironwoods, palo verdes. Out of those three, I would say that the mesquite is probably the easiest to actually make something edible with, right? Then we're talking about mulching, chopping and dropping, mesquite prunings. You're not going to really be able to walk through there because there's going to be a lot of thorns, right? So what kind of happens is, depending on where the basin is and the pathways, you might not be able to chop and drop right there. So it is very different, because if you look at all these plants, they don't have thorns on them. You could probably just use them, like, prune them up, drop them, walk all over it. And it's obviously wet here, so it's going to break down probably in a couple months and create amazing soil. And it's just so dry here, like it's just going to be a different reality here.
Large legume trees, and we have large fruit trees. So we have jackfruit, the largest fruit in the world. We have bunya pine, a very large nut, but we also have pecan, which is a nut tree here that's also deciduous, loses its leaves in winter. Then we have your classic mango as a large overstory tree. These are all space occupiers in a system that's incredibly stable when all the layers are complete and occupied. We don't want to go the other way round. We don't want to start with a productive species and work hard with lots of inputs to keep them in a healthy state. The support species do the work for us. It can be up to 95% of the mass in the early years are the legume trees and the mulch producing trees that produce the biomass. We prune these, and these trees shed nitrogen to the soil because they have relationships. They're classic pioneers, and most are nitrogen fixing species. In other words, they have rhizobium bacterial partners in the soil that take.
So I agree with all of this, and this is a lot of what the native plants do. Mesquites, ironwoods, palo verdes, they're all nitrogen fixing trees. So it's just a matter of building up your infrastructure and your soil through plants.
Take nitrogen from the air in the soil and bring it into their plant bodies, and they then eventually die, and that nitrogen is added to the soil. Now we can speed that process up. We can sacrifice those species with good timing after we've put them into relative placement. So over time, the species we sacrifice open up opportunities for our productive species. They shelter and support and provide the fertilizer, the soil conditioning, and the humus. So we stack the system in space, but we prune in relation to time. So we wait for the time of year when there is more rainfall than evaporation. After the period where it's been dry and the evaporation is higher than rainfall, there we need shade, and we leave the shade up. But as soon as the rainfall gets heavier and higher than the evaporation, we can start to cut.
So this would be, again, for areas that are very wet. Here in the Sonoran Desert, in terms of doing this, I would do it in the winter when the sap is not flowing, if you are gonna sacrifice some trees. And you can definitely do this with native plants and sacrifice them and build up soil with the biomass.
Open up light avenues and space for our productive species to take up the gap. Now, over time, when we get to establishment, we've got less and less mass in pioneer support species and more mass in the productive species. And we end up with a reversal of mass. We have 95% productive and only 5% in support. So we don't just stack in space, we stack in time, and we speed up the process.
So again, this is another point that all these folks are not even practicing or doing. Folks are just planting fruit trees, and they have a orchard in the city and they're calling it a food forest. For example, to me, it makes sense to put in mesquites, wolfberries, hackberries, nopales, or like an elderberry, a Mexican elderberry. Plants like that would thrive in a urban lot that has been re-landscaped to harvest rainwater, and it would produce a lot of food, and you could still have your vegetable gardens, and you could still have some gray water basins that harvest rainwater that hold a couple fruit trees. You could still have, 4 to 5 fruit trees, and just cut the ones that you need to cut when the water runs out, I guess. But the less fruit trees you have, the more sustainable it is. I myself have 2 fruit trees, and we're able to grow them with minimal tap water usage. We usually use the tap water when we're out of town, and it's on a drip irrigation system. When we're in town, it gets gray water and rainwater from our tank. So this is something that's definitely not happening here. There's no planting in time. There's no people are not doing it like that here. People are just going into a space and putting in fruit trees without any regard to how the rainwater flows through that site, and without even thinking about planting the rain. So this is a really good video. I've learned about food forests just through being in permaculture trainings and circles. But it is nice to hear Geoff's take on it and how he's implementing it and how he thinks about it. It's kind of making me think more about what it would look like here in terms of what plants could be used for chop and drop. And one that kind of stands out would be moringa, because it's a great producing plant. A moringa tree is not native to the Sonoran Desert, but it is definitely, I look at it the same as kind of a chase tree or a bay leaf tree. They're small trees that are drought tolerant, and they can thrive off of rainwater if they're kind of in a nice spot that gets a little bit more wet. So they're kind of like to me, they're kind of on the same level as kind of a wolfberry. It's a native plant, but it's gonna need a little bit more water than like a cactus, right? Like choya buds or prickly pears.
These legume support trees that have been cut off as pollards may look a bit harsh, but they very quickly start to regrow. You can see here little shoots coming everywhere, and they're all the same. With the regrowth, we get a beautiful shade. Now that's handy in the hot time of year when we've got a lot of evaporation over rainfall, and it's actually a nurse crop for your fruit trees when they're young. Later on, we may cut them more regularly and keep feeding the soil, and eventually we may cut them out at a lower cut. They'll shoot a few more times, we'll keep adding that mulch, and eventually we'll cut them at ground level and not allow them to grow leaves so they actually die out. It's our choice. We're actually manipulating the forest so that it grows in our favor towards productive species. We change the way it grows in our favor. So
I've actually done this with volunteer mesquites and palo verdes, and it works really well.
here you see the pollard regrowth, and in just a few months in the subtropics you can gain all this wood. Now it might be once a year in a temperate climate, once every 6 months, every 3 months in the tropics. You're working with the cycles of the forest within climate, so you're feeding the soil with a fallen forest, and you're designing the way the forest falls. We can use animals to help us establish food forests. We can graze with larger animals, then they have to be out of the way because we're putting in the small plants. We can put in poultry, chickens and ducks, and they can prepare the ground. And then later on, when the trees are up, we can bring in maintenance cycles of chickens and ducks to speed the system up. And that way we can use our animals to gain an advantage while they're productive for us at the same time. I'm sitting in a food forest that's been recovered by ducks. This section here was well out of maintenance. They had quite a lot of long clumping grasses and unwanted plants we call weeds. We've put a fence around it, a temporary fence, electric fence, but we haven't even electrified it. We put in 100 or so Muscovy ducks. In just over 3 weeks, they've totally changed the area. They've eaten most of the green material. They've flattened out the grasses. They've manured the ground. They've conditioned the soil. And it's ready for replanting with the support species and interplants and fruit trees where there's gaps. Taking this time advantage, this process of dynamic event, we can now jump in and put in a whole assembly of plants that'll bring it to a diverse interactive stability and possibly go right through to maintenance without ever needing this event to happen again. This is taking time advantage from an animal interaction to a replant, which we can do any time we slip up on our maintenance.
So again, I just want you to think about the thoughtfulness going behind the design. And this is a tropical ecosystem, so the weeds are going to be a problem. They're going to overgrow a spot. And it is going to take something like cows or chickens or ducks to go in there and bring balance back to that area so that you could do your permaculture food forest thing. So here in the drylands, our weed season would be pretty much after monsoon. So you could do something similar with chickens, goats, cows, depending on how much land you have.
3 weeks ago, the ducks were here. Now it's recovered. We've planted in the support species and extra fruit trees. We've established extra ground covers, and we've got a little footpath surrounded by wood prunings, branch prunings going right the way through on contour. It's on its way, and it's probably going into a permanent, stable system from here on in. Food forests function as a living ecosystem, and they are so diverse and so stable. And there is nothing like this in modern agriculture. Nothing as diverse, nothing as stable, nothing as fertile. The production of soil is constant. The fertility is constantly increasing. The diversity of production is non-stop. So with a food forest system, you have a system that self-replicates over time. There are no systems that produce as much per square meter for the smallest amount of inputs. This is a system that is proven, even in urban agriculture. Many people have heard my quote, "You can solve all the world's problems in a garden." But what a lot of people don't know about that quote is, I'm referring to food forests. They will work anywhere. And these systems give us permanent security worldwide. We just need people to realize that if we all move in this same direction, we can solve all the world's problems in our food forest gardens and supply all our needs without causing any damage whatsoever. In fact, we, humanity, can be the most beneficial element on this planet.
That's what's frustrating about the whole Phoenix permaculture scene, is that they missed a big aspect of the importance of doing a food forest. And Geoff does a good job of coming back to the point of the long-term sustainability aspects of a food forest and the longevity and the food security that it brings. So again, if you're in the drylands like I am, the exotic plants are going to be like plan C or plan D. Plan A is going to be harvesting the rainwater, planting it. So that's all plan A. And then plan B is going to be to fill in the space with native food-bearing plants. And you can have your fruit trees there, you can have your gardens there. That's going to be supplemental. That's not going to be the base. It cannot be the base because there's not enough rainwater for it to sustain itself. And that is the major disconnect when we're talking about planting hundreds of fruit trees in Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert. It is not something that can be sustained over a long period of time. It is not something that everyone can do. And we can kind of carry that forward 50, 60 years. It really seems that in the next 5 to 10 years, people that have been planting hundreds of fruit trees are going to be put into a situation where they're going to have to chop those trees down. And that time spent doing all that work and putting all those resources into an orchard, which is being misnomered as a food forest, redirected into actually making a real food forest that has long-term viability in the Sonoran Desert, in the drylands. I have a whole video that walks through all the plants that I feel would lend themselves to a food forest on my YouTube channel. It has a bunch of views on it. It's one of my most viewed videos. So I've gone through kind of the list that I feel lends itself to farming and to food production. So you can build a food forest off of rainwater that's going to thrive and not just survive. And that's kind of a major aspect to this that is being lost when you just go about planting an orchard, because an orchard is not a food forest in the drylands. We're not in a subtropical environment like Geoff is in this video. We are in some parts of Arizona only get 6 inches of rain a year. And that's not a lot, but that's enough for mesquites to produce pounds and pounds and pounds of flour, edible flour, gourmet flour that you can actually make pancakes and bread with, and make food. You can even make gluten-free food with it. So to me, why would I not be growing prickly pear and eating prickly pear pods? It's just a very productive plant. It's very easy to grow. Why wouldn't you grow a bunch of it? And why wouldn't you learn how to eat it if it's not part of your culture? It's part of my culture. I grew up eating desert foods. So to me, I think part of the disconnect that is also happening in the Arizona gardening permaculture scene is that folks are not recognizing that the native plants are food and it's viable to farm it. And that's what our energy should be focused on. I've done several of these videos now, and I've yet to see a prickly pear patch, a cholla bud patch, any of the extremely drought tolerant food bearing crops. It's all fruit trees, and it's just a simple orchard, but it's being called a food forest, but it's not a food forest. And this is why I was kind of curious to see because this is my first time seeing this video. I have seen lectures by Geoff, and he is really big on food forest theory, and it is a theory, and I've heard him talk about it. It was nice to see this video with the animation. It's good to hear his take on it, and I do agree that it for most environments where it's not as extreme as mine in terms of the lack of water, this is the way to grow. Like, why would you, like, if you're in, like, I don't know, let's say Pennsylvania or something, why would you not do this? If you're in an area where it rains a lot, like Oregon or Washington, why would you not do this? Like, I would, with the amount of rain that goes on over there, I would imagine that if I'm eating a watermelon in my yard and I'm just like spitting the seeds out, they're gonna probably germinate and start growing. Like, it's just, there is levels to what can be done based on the ecosystem you're living in. So to me, this is an extremely important theory that has the potential to completely change our food security and community, how we build community around food, long-term sustainability of cities. This is a big solution to a lot of problems. I do agree in that aspect. I just feel that the way that people have been rolling it out in Arizona is wrong. And there's just no way around it. You can't just put a bunch of fruit trees and just, have a orchard, a rather large orchard in an urban environment, because there's folks with 200 fruit trees in the city, and they are flood irrigating their property with Colorado River water, which is being cut this year by 500,000 acre feet. It's just doesn't seem that it's going to be something that is going to have that long-term sustainability factor baked into the cake. It's instead the wall is baked into the cake. We're going to hit a wall at some point, and the water's not going to be there. All the folks growing grass and fruit trees in Phoenix are going to have to end that practice unless we can figure out a way to repurpose water for landscape, like have reclaimed water uh, that can be tapped into for municipal landscape irrigation needs. But that doesn't exist right now unless you're doing your own gray water system. So it's just, to me, I feel that I understand the urge to want to grow a bunch of fruit trees and harvest a bunch of fruit. I definitely understand that urge, and I have that urge myself. But I also know that we're in a very harsh environment, and I knew we were going to be going through a super mega drought in my lifetime, and that the water is going to end in my lifetime. So I really put in the work to do rainwater harvesting on our land and in any space that I've been involved with. I've done it at my wife's massage studio. I've done it at my friends' houses, families, friends, citywide projects, large community spaces. I've worked on so many projects, hundreds and hundreds of projects. So I've been kind of on the front lines, on the ground, teaching people how to harvest rainwater. I think we're at a point where we're pretty much gonna hit that wall in the next couple of years, where whatever excuses people have for planting a bunch of fruit trees, exotic plants in Phoenix, that is gonna end, because it's just gonna be so outlandish. It's gonna be like growing grass in the desert. That is just, why are you doing that, right? It doesn't make any sense. And I think we're going to get to that point in the next couple of years. We're not there yet, but one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video is because I wanted to really tackle the idea of what a food forest is. And Geoff Lawton is kind of the main guru in the permaculture community when it comes to food forest gardening. And I really enjoyed watching this video. Um, it really kind of highlighted where people are missing certain key aspects of what his message is. And I feel that if he was in Arizona, me and him would pretty much be on the same page. I think that if I had a conversation with this man, he was out here and he saw what was going on. I think he and me would be on the same page with what folks are missing, what people missed, and how it changes based off of the ecosystem that you're in and the resources that are there. But yes, like this is a good overview, a quick recap of what an actual food forest is. So again, it's going to be something that is sustainable, something that is going to be self-replicating, so a regenerative system. And I've talked about these things in other videos, but we're just going to have to hammer this. And it's going to be a actual living, breathing part of the natural ecosystem that it is anchored in, right? So it's going to kind of you're going to tap in to the life force that is all around you. And that's kind of what the special thing is about permaculture, is that it's just not about gardening. It's about establishing a regenerative system, which means that you're tapping in to the local ecosystem that you're a part of. And that's where the power of a food forest really is. Once you start putting in your mesquite trees and your wolfberries and your prickly pear pads and your cholla buds and elderberry trees and all these things, and you're like year 10 into it, that's when you're gonna realize like, wow, like I'm doing minimal labor to have all of this abundance. And that's why I think people are missing, is that when you just are putting in an orchard and you think you're doing a food forest, you are creating so much labor for yourself, because the irrigation is going to be the most intensive part of the whole system. So there's going to have to be an irrigation system, whether you're flood irrigating it or you're using an actual irrigation system. Either way, you're going to have to do all that work so that you have a system that cannot survive a mega drought, right? Versus if you have an actual Sonoran Desert food forest with mesquite trees, prickly pear pads, cholla buds, you're going to be harvesting well through a drought where people are having to cut down their fruit trees that they planted 15 years ago when the times were good. And that's kind of what folks are missing, is that it's not about this year, next year. It's about 20 years from now and what's still going to be producing and what's not. And the native plants are going to thrive. And especially if you hook them up with earthworks and you work with the land and the rainwater resources that are on your land, these plants are going to just take off and thrive. And they're going to yield a massive amount of real food that you can eat throughout the year. Don't get caught up in the hype, y'all. Don't get caught up in the hype. I would like to plant hundreds of fruit trees myself and have an amazing orchard. That would be an amazing thing to do. But the reality is that those days are gone. Those days are long gone. I've just been focusing on planting native food bearing plants and putting that message out to help people get through the next decades where it's gonna get rough out here and people are gonna be losing water. But even if you lose water, that doesn't mean that you can't harvest rainwater. You're still gonna get water when it rains. So to me, that's just always step number one. And you can have a whole food forest with just plants that can thrive on rainwater. All right, so that's my little rant. Thank you all for watching the video. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you would like to support my work, please consider becoming a Patreon member at www.patreon.com/the Sonoran Desert Grower. I have many different levels. There's a lot of perks to becoming a Patreon member. I take care of my community, my Patreon member community. They make these videos possible. And I just want to thank everybody in my Patreon community for the support. And I plan on making more videos like this where we kind of get into the theory of permaculture, and I'll select videos that I haven't seen before and I'll react to them, and I'll kind of try to adapt the information for the Sonoran Desert, for Arizona, for the drylands. So I hope you enjoyed this video and we'll see you in the next one.